Good afternoon. My name is Carling, and I'm the program coordinator with the BC Bereavement Helpline, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker for today's event, Dr. Amy Tan. Dr. Amy Tan is a palliative care and family physician, educator, researcher, anti-racism consultant, writer, and health equity advocate. Dr. Tan is a clinical associate professor in the Division of Palliative Care and Department of Family Practice at the UBC Faculty of Medicine. She's the Director of Teacher Assessment and Support in UBC's Faculty of Medicine's Development Office and an Anti-Racism Support Program faculty mentor for UBC's Family Medicine Residency Program. Dr. Tan is also a section editor for Racism and Health for PLOS Global Health Journal that addresses deeply entrenched global inequities in public health. In this presentation, Dr. Amy Tan will discuss why anti-racism and equity is important in healthcare, the ways in which racism can present itself in grief and bereavement support services, and suggestions for how to address it with increased awareness and effort towards achieving more racial equity. We are honored to have her with us today. Please note that BCBH supports equity, diversity, and safety in regards to open discourse on racism and grief and bereavement topics. We will not tolerate any negative comments in the live Q&A of this presentation and will be moderating accordingly.
Thank you very much for this invitation to give this webinar on dismantling racism in grief and bereavement care. I do want to start off with saying that I am coming to you with deep respect and gratitude from the unceded, traditional, and unsurrendered lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, namely the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich First Nations, whose historical relationships with this land continues to this day. And I am very grateful in my clinical work to be able to work closely with the Wasanich First Nations here locally. So I don't have any disclosures, and as I said, this was an invited presentation, so thank you so much for the invitation. I also do want to start with some warnings that some of the content here may be a little bit uncomfortable for people to hear and listen to. I ask when talking about racism and anti-racism that you try to lean into it because really that discomfort is really needed for critical reflection. And I really believe that learning happens at the edge of that comfort zone. And if any of the topics I bring up are triggering or cause you to have memories of your own, please also take care of yourself as well. Maybe take a break and talk to a safe person, for example. So the objectives of this webinar are to talk briefly about what anti-racism and equity mean and what they pertain to with regards to the importance in healthcare and when we're providing care for patients and families, and how this actually can present itself, how racism can present itself in grief and bereavement support services and care. And so also then to end off with some concrete suggestions on how to address it with this increased awareness in the effort to dismantle racism in grief and bereavement care. So I'm going to start off with some definitions just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all talking about the same thing. So the first thing I want to say is that, race actually is a social, historical, and social construct. It's actually arbitrary. It is not based on biology, despite years in history of teaching so. I graduated from medicine 20 years ago, and even in my training and in the first few years of my career, it was very much still said that race had a biological construct upon which there was differences in people's physiology, and that is actually not true. And we need to, first of all, dismantle that myth that really race is arbitrary, and it was actually created to justify hierarchies of humanity for social, economic, and political power and gain. While race is arbitrary, the effects of racism are in fact very real. And racism is the othering, the differential treatment of human racial groups by a dominant racial group. And in the context of Canada, it is the dominant racial group is really people of European descent, and it comes from the founding and the history of Canada, which we'll talk about. And it is rooted in, like I said, a social, political, economic belief that people of European descent coming to Canada and settling here and taking land and resources away from the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, on which Canada resides, were and are superior to people who are not of European descent. And racism is very real and takes many forms, and we're going to talk about how this impacts people. So at its outset, Canada actually is founded on, like I said, the colonization, settler colonization of people, Indigenous people on Turtle Island. And it was the dehumanization of Indigenous people to extract resources and to remove culture from the Indigenous people that unfortunately continues to this day through policy and also through ongoing inequities. Canada, being a settler colonial state, is again based on the belief that people of European descent are superior. And that is what was used to justify the genocide of Indigenous people at the outset of Canada being discovered. We also have a history of having Black slaves, so people who were forcibly displaced from Africa in the transatlantic slave trade, coming to Canada. And while we talk about Canada being part of the Underground Railroad and being part of the freedom part of the Underground Railroad, unfortunately, we do also in Canada have our own history with slaves being part of the founding of this country. And again, there is systemic inequities that continue to this day, which is known as anti-Black racism. So we have Indigenous specific racism and we have anti-Black racism. And then we also have the third tenet upon which Canada was founded, pre-Confederation, which is the exploitation and half-price labor of Chinese railway workers who came from China and unfortunately were exploited and given the most dangerous jobs to build the railroad. And it's estimated that one Chinese railway worker died for every 3 miles of railway that was constructed. And after the railway was built, they in fact were forced to leave the country through immigration policies such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Chinese head tax. I give you all of this historical context to show upon which our society is built and upon which the institutions and the policies of Canada are built and how they sustain and perpetuate inequities and racism to this day. So when we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, it's different than anti-racism in that we need to be speaking about the systemic nature of racism in this country before we can even have equity, diversity, and inclusion. When we talk about equality, equity, and justice, we're really talking about people and their resources that they may have access to and what access they need in order to actually achieve the same finishing line as anybody else. And so when we talk about equality, which is giving people the same resources, as you can see in this picture, the giving the same resources won't help in having the person on the right pick apples because they can't reach the tree and there's actually no apples on that side of the tree. Equity is actually looking at what needs to be done to close that gap, to allow for resources that might look different because they need to close the gap in access. And so a taller ladder may help on the right side to actually reach the tree. But it still doesn't take into consideration that the tree is not having apples on that side, and the tree is leaning away from the longer ladder. And so justice is actually creating system changes to actually look at the root causes for the inequity, which in this case, in this context, is namely systemic racism, and what we need to do to make changes so that regardless of people's race, that they have access to the same resources and the system actually allows for ongoing access to the same resources. So this is abstract concept, but really it's to talk about the 4 types of racism that exist in society. So racism is individual and systemic. And so when we talk about systemic racism, that is really, again, all of the rules and policies upon which society is based. And then you have the institution that continues to perpetuate that. So any institution in Canada, be it healthcare, the legal system, the justice system, the prison system, the child welfare system, the immigration policies, they all have perpetuated over these years, over 150 years that Canada has been in existence and since pre-Confederation, rules of engagement that have given people of European descent the advantage, just in terms of how the policies have perpetuated. What this leads to is it leads to certain stereotyping and certain othering of people who are not of European descent, and constant messaging from media, from Hollywood, from newspapers, from books that we read, that the norm is people of European descent. And that leads to interpersonal racism, which is people acting on certain prejudices that they have gotten from just surviving and thriving in Canadian society, and then acting on those prejudices with the power that the dominant group or institutions or society have given them, and enacting harm on an individual. Another part of racism, which is not well known, is the internalized racism. So this is racism within people. It includes people who look like me. It includes people who are racialized, Black, Indigenous, Asian, otherwise racialized people who also have learned the same messages and been bombarded by the same messages living in Canadian society, that we are not as good or not the norm as European descent people are. And therefore we have learned our own type of racism where we feel that we are not as good as people of European descent. And that comes out in how we treat ourselves and how we treat others. And so Peggy McIntosh had talked about racism and the invisible backpack of privilege. And she said, I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness and not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. So this is really talking about how it's not about hate, it's not about individual hate, it's not about individual behavior. This is an ongoing systemic rules of engagement and policies that actually create this ongoing system of imbalance and power imbalance, which is ultimately what racism is. So how this actually comes up is, people like to think of racism as only the most extreme events. January 6th, Capitol storming of the Capitol last year, very egregious offenses that make the news as racism. But I hope you can see by the different forms of racism that it actually all goes much, much further beneath the surface. And there are, again, parts that are invisible with regards to policies of immigration, banking, that lead to overrepresentation in the justice system, police brutality, housing discrimination, lack of reserve, safe drinking water. And then it goes down to the more interpersonal things of people saying, well, I, wasn't part of the slave trade. continue to perpetuate perhaps this notion that being colorblind is not being racist, when really that's perhaps not honoring people's differences in lived experiences because of the systems that have created inequities. And then it goes right down to saying that one is neutral and does not want to weigh in on things like racism. And what all of these examples of racism that exist in daily life for people who are racialized in Canada result in is dehumanization, silencing, not belonging, shame, grief, and trauma. And so I can hope that by describing this, that we can see how this interplays with people who are bereaved and grief. But we're also going to bring this open up as to how perhaps grief may look different for racialized populations and communities. So I wanted to also just put out there that I think that a lot of Canadians think that we're post-racial and that racism is no longer a problem. And I wanted to just dismantle that myth as well, that when Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister, at that time, said in 1971 that Canada had a multiculturalism policy and therefore we were a multicultural utopia. And also around the same time, previously, there was Martin Luther King Jr., who had given his I Dream a Dream speech, where the most quoted sentence has been taken out of context, where he said he dreamt that his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. In that speech, he actually said, we're not there yet and we have lots of work to do. And that seems to be part of the message that has gotten missed. And so I would argue that while it's great aspiration, we are not there yet because we didn't do the work to actually get there. Why? And how did we perhaps not get the work done? Is because we've taught ourselves in society, especially my generation, the Gen Xers, is, that to be colorblind is to be post-racial, to buy into the model minority myth, which actually pits different racialized groups against each other as a way to deny systemic racism and put blame on individuals, not taking into context the systemic barriers that different groups have, especially Black and Indigenous people in Canada. Thinking, growing up in school in Canada, that we were the multicultural mosaic and nobody had to assimilate, when in fact the daily lived experience of racialized people is that assimilation was required to feel like one could belong. And then there's the ongoing rewriting of history in terms of Canadian history. We are seeing right now, to this day, the horrific recovery of unmarked graves in residential schools. And that is part of what we need to really face as the truth of our country, not just historically, but to this day, the ongoing damage and pain that Canadians have inflicted on Indigenous people of this land. And that wasn't taught in schools up until more recently. And so the children today in school are learning about it finally, but I can say that having been born and raised in Canada, I did not learn about it growing up. And so that continues the perpetuation of stereotypes and again, the denial of the existence of ongoing racism. I would argue, though, that we really shouldn't be looking at this as a summit that we should be going up to and then cresting, because when we crest and we think that it's something to be achieved and then we are done, when we become complacent and we are not actively anti-racist, that's when the ongoing perpetuation of systemic racism will occur. And so we need to be actively anti-racist. We need to be actively dismantling systemic racism. How do we get there? And so while I think, my generation was taught not to point out differences, not to be humble and curious about people's differences and different lived experiences, we in fact actually have to honor and celebrate those differences. And how different people have come to be where they are is based on different personalized lived experiences that then now lead to personalized needs. And that's from a combination of systemic and individual circumstances. And so in order to achieve this aspirational equity, which is different needs must be given to different people to actually overcome these systemic barriers. So it's not about treating everybody the same. It's in fact honoring people's differences and understanding that people will have different needs because the system has not allowed for the equality that we aspire to still, but we have not yet achieved in society. I want to go back to the words of people like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, who really had it figured out back decades ago. And it really was, again, about their quotes talking about diversity, celebrating differences. And actually, that is what we need to become closer and to be able to achieve more of the equity that we are seeking for people to, in the future, as an aspiration, be in fact equal. So I've talked about how settler colonization, the founding of Canada, based on European settlers conferring advantage for people of European descent, that leads to systemic racism and all of the other types of racism I've just talked about, but it also leads to something that's been discussed a lot in public discourse in the last few years about power and privilege. And so it's about the systems and the policies have given unearned, invisible benefit to one group based on their racial identity. It is not to say that people who are of European descent have not had hardship in their life, or have, it is not to say that they have, been born with a silver spoon in their mouth. It is to say that the challenges that one may have are for other things other than their race. And then it's really important to talk about intersectionality too, because for every human being that lives on Earth, we are all three-dimensional human beings. So, I am not merely defined by being Asian or female or a person who lives with disabilities or a physician, etc. I am all of those things. And all of those things have different relevance in whatever encounter or interpersonal encounter I'm part of in that given day, time, hour. There are some things that are invisible, and there's some things about me that are visible that people will then automatically create a construct upon which to interact with me. So as an Asian woman, those are two things that are visible that I will not be able to tease apart. And so the notion of intersectionality actually comes from a legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, who wrote when she was arguing about workplace discrimination for Black women, that the discrimination and the workplace environment could not be judged against discrimination that Black men would experience or white women would experience, because it is the intersection of both being Black and being a woman that creates its own set of identities and stereotypes upon which that person would then be judged. And so it's not just a summation of where you may have more privilege based on society having given unearned advantage to cisgender, heterosexual, abled white males who, are settlers to Canada. It really has to do with all of the intersections upon which identities are formed and how they actually interplay in all of the human interactions we have. So this is just another way to show that the power and privilege are focused on people who society has seen as the norm. So, when you turn on the news, who looks like a newscaster? When you turn on, you read a book, who do you imagine as being the character in the book? When race is not identified, people assume that person is white as the quote unquote norm. It's not until you actually say a Black person or an Asian person, do you realize that that needs to be pointed out, but we don't say that for white people. So that's just an example. In healthcare, we will say that. We will say, a 72-year-old male, but then we'll also say 72-year-old Black male or Asian male. So this is just to show how society continues to perpetuate whiteness as a norm. So we know that racism exists daily. We know that racism exists in the healthcare system. This is from the In Plain Sight report from BC that showed that there was Indigenous specific racism in the BC healthcare system. And so for all, this brings together everything that I've just talked about with regards to colonialism, the colonial construct of healthcare system, how that leads to stereotypes and discrimination at the interpersonal level, which then leads to less access because people, who are Indigenous, but also otherwise racialized because of their past experiences and stereotyping, will feel less safe in the healthcare system. And then it actually affects their health outcomes. And so when you're talking about people who are needing grief and bereavement care, the similar aspects of this are all related because, again, if a loved one has died within a healthcare system, perhaps there has been experiences of discrimination and racism that has affected not only the loved one's death or loved one's journey to death, but also may impact the loved one's grief now. And those who are left to grieve this person may be compounded in their grief with elements of having seen or witnessed their dying loved one's discrimination, but they themselves may have been discriminated in being part of the healthcare system and part of the support system for the patient who has now died. This is actually from a study that I did a number of years ago, and it was about barriers to a good death. And what came out of this thesis was really about anticipatory grief and working with families with regards to anticipatory grief and how to overcome some of that to actually be able to make decisions. And that there was a ripple effect, that if there was conflict during the decision-making process, that there was a ripple effect with complicated grief and PTSD for the bereaved afterwards. And what I found was that, again, mistrust of the system, cultural, religious values differences, what I would name racism now with the evolving language and discourse that I didn't use in 2011, I would use now as some of those risk factors and some of those things that need to be teased out during the grief process, during the bereavement process, so that we can see how that has impacted the grief at hand, but perhaps the cumulative effect of grief to this day based on previous experiences. In the last couple of years, especially with the COVID pandemic, we have seen also what I call collective grief in communities that have unfortunately continued to have the ongoing trauma of people who look like them and people in their community die, be it from police brutality, like the death of George Floyd, to the recovery of unmarked graves for the Indigenous population, the East Asian women who identified with the Atlanta shooting a year ago. There have been several ongoing examples of people who are identifying with a collective grief in their communities that are about race and identity. So while we can talk about the individual person who might need grief and bereavement care having specific and very direct racism experiences within the healthcare system in Canada that impacts a person's grief and their need for support, we also need to be looking at this in a bigger picture way. And perhaps this bereavement is bringing up other types of grief that have an interplay with regards to race and racism and one's lived experiences. And we need to actually be looking at that when we are supporting people. Is there a bigger collective grief component that is affecting things? So that's the first way that second way that racism may show up, more than the individual racism events leading up to the death of a loved one, but the collective grief that is happening in society. The other way that collective grief is actually showing up is in this COVID-19 pandemic. We know that racialized groups, especially Black, Indigenous, Hispanic in the US, are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and the deaths. And so again, that collective grief with regards to an increased number of deaths from COVID-19 also is part of this ongoing grief, upon which a more specific bereavement of a bereaved loved one may be actually opening up bigger feelings, but also bigger contexts that need to be explored when we are supporting people who are grieving actively. We also know, similar to what I just said with regards to COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, Hispanic groups especially, is that racism in society also creates a ripple effect in grief and bereavement. So when we're looking at police brutality, increased police brutality to Black and Indigenous people in Canada, it means that people may have had increased exposure to death of loved ones, community members, neighbors, friends that they identify with much younger in life and through more traumatic ways. And again, that has impact over a person. So again, while they may not be formally bereaved because of a specific relationship of a family member or a close friend, they will have been experiencing, like I said, this collective grief that accumulates over time and in and of itself is ongoing trauma. They also may have their own experiences of daily racism that may also be adding to this grief, and that affects health, and in this context, grief and bereavement. What we've also seen, again highlighted with COVID-19, is with the physical distancing rules, with the changes in gathering, that people have not been able to grieve and mourn in the same ways for everybody throughout the pandemic. When a specific racial group has very specific ways of mourning and those are disrupted, that can also affect grief and bereavement. And so while COVID-19 has highlighted that for all cultural, racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, there has been an ongoing loss of different cultural ways of mourning and burial that have been less and less accessible to people in North America, as even funeral homes continue to create Western ways of grieving and Western ways of norms of funeral rites. So for example, I am of Chinese descent, and regardless of the different religions that are present in my extended family, the mourning rituals and the death ceremonies with regards to the Chinese culture all kind of converge regardless of religion. And if you're in Vancouver, you may have great access to funeral homes that understand quite deeply these funeral rites. If you're in a place that has not the same type of population or clientele, so to speak, they won't. And so I have actually come into contact being a palliative care physician, where I've had patients who wanted very specific Chinese cultural funeral rites that could not actually be provided for them in a smaller center that wasn't aware of those. And so this is part of, the racism that gets perpetuated because of the ongoing norms of society upon which we live in Canadian society. Another way that grief and bereavement can be impacted by race is also race is very much tied to cultural beliefs in terms of individualism versus collectivism. Again, I think COVID-19 is again showing us how countries in Asia with masking and collectivism might be different than North America with regards to the individualistic Western culture and priorities that are given. And so when a person is bereaved, the focus can be on the person and how the person is grieving based on Western ways of grieving. But in fact, some people will be of a culture that is much more collectivist, and their grief is so intertwined with their family and their community that you can't tease it out. And so it really becomes, how can we support people with what looks different, perhaps? What looks different from even psychology and psychological practices with regards to supporting grief and bereavement that might be based on more of an individualistic construct. An example that's parallel is palliative care really focuses on personal autonomy and decision making. And what I've found in my work in looking at equity and palliative care leading up to grief and bereavement is that there are many racial groups and many cultural groups that actually, in fact, don't want personal autonomy. They want a collectivist, family, community-centered approach. And when forced to, again, conform to Western ways and Western constructs, it actually causes them harm. And so this is another thing we need to be looking at when we look at grief and bereavement is their grief may look different. Their expressions of grief may look different, but their needs might not be about themselves at a certain time. It might be more about how their family is taken care of before they can even think about their own grief. And there's no, as we talk about in grief and bereavement, there's no right way of grieving. But I know that, in terms of support, the structures in which people are trained, we need to be careful that we aren't trying to impose one way of understanding grief, that there are other ways of understanding grief globally. So, question to think about in supporting a person with different cultural, ethnic, racial background is, now that there's more awareness to what racism is, to the experiences that people may have, to the cumulative effect that people who are racialized may have in their daily life, and then in their perhaps illness course that they support a loved one, and their grief and bereavement, is what are norms for this person? Be open to asking, what are those norms? They might look different for you because you may not have been experienced to it. So find out. And it's not about stereotyping certain group. And you'll notice that I haven't named and said, this group wants this. Everybody is allowed to be a three-dimensional human being, but to also realize that we are influenced by our race and our culture and the traditions that we're brought up with. And so it's about being open to those and making space to hear about that. Because also one's cultural, ethnic, racial beliefs on how they make meaning about a death in general is really important. How that death might be specific to the loved one, were there constructs, were there issues with regards to stigma that might be affecting the death. Different cultural groups will have different ways of not only expressing the grief, but also in perhaps understanding the grief, and also in perhaps thinking, am I justified in my grief? And so we need to be thinking about these things and making space for this. We've talked about the mourning practices already and how, disrupting those may have caused some issues. And so what do we do with that? And in supporting people with grief and bereavement, we talk about this 1 year mark. There are other cultural aspects. Some people, some religions, some different cultures have different anniversaries that mark and signpost things along the way in their journey. And so how do we support people with regards to that? I think at the crux is really active listening and being open to different ways of knowing that you might not understand how people are grieving. You might not understand how people are making meaning of the death in a racial or cultural context. And so it's really about giving space and being present for that person, giving them their undivided attention so that you're listening with your eyes and your ears, giving them 100% of your attention, and you have the heart to be open. And I really like this Chinese character, not only because it speaks to my own racial identity and my culture, but I think because the character in itself speaks to all the things that we need to do. We need to be treating the person as royalty in front of us and really giving space for whatever it is that their experiences are and validating those. So when you have, people who are coming to you for grief and bereavement support, how can you ensure that you are creating a safe space? How are you not minimizing when they bring up their experiences of racism, how it may be impacting their grief, how it may be impacting their sense of justice or injustice with regards to their bereavement? Are you minimizing it? Are you invalidating it? Or are you being open to those people's experiences and validating it for their lived experience and their ability to have made meaning on those experiences? So if somebody comes to you and says, there was racism leading up to my loved one's death, and that really, there's a lot of anger and I can't actually get through to my grief without processing that anger. Are we making space for that? Are we validating that? Or are we quick to minimize it and say, I'm sure that wasn't the problem, which I think we're all socialized to say, and try to focus on the grief? And so that's just a very quick off the cuff example of how we need to be open to how racism, collective grief impact the grief that we're trying to support in the moment. Also, have there been past lived experiences that are influencing the reactions now? How do you, as a physician, I'm acutely aware of the power differential being a physician, regardless of my race and gender. As a physician, I understand there's a power differential between myself and a patient. There's a power differential in somebody seeking help with regards to support and bereavement. How are we actually actively dismantling that power differential so patients, clients feel that they have the safety to open up and to provide their lived expertise and analysis of what is going on for them? And it might be that you might not understand it, but it's about, again, opening up space and being open and not dismissing, but validating these analyses that are happening based on a racialized person's understanding of the world, based on their lifetime of having navigated society as a racialized person. And then it's really important to have debriefing with somebody that you can talk about these tricky issues with, and know that it's not going to be perfect, but by being open and by going into your discomfort about your understanding of racism, how it impacts people, it's really important. And so I want to leave you with just a takeaway with regards to how we can create space for people who may be in grief and bereavement, showing that racism, collective grief, past experiences with racism, either in the healthcare system or in society, may be impacting their grief, how they have learned to interact with their family, how they make meaning out of their grief. How do you actually absorb that and actually validate patients and clients who might have a different world perspective on grief, but also worldview on how they've made meaning as they're trying to process their own grief? And so validating, acknowledging any harm, listening, inviting those emotions, decentering yourself. So it's not about debating whether or not the racism has occurred, but to validate that the racism has occurred and how this is impacting them. And really, it's about acting with courage and naming it. So that's part of the validation. And when I talk about moving the needle and engaging a follow up from a grief and bereavement perspective, that's what can you do as a professional? What can you do as somebody who's supporting a person in grief and bereavement? How can you help them in your program so that your program is more inclusive? How can you help with regards to even the discipline of grief and bereavement care and the interdisciplinary aspect of different people of different expertise helping support people collectively with grief and bereavement? How do we actually ensure that people are being open to these kinds of conversations, even if it has led to individual discomfort for the clinicians who are trying to help? And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and your attention, and look forward to the question and answer period. Thank you.
Hello, so we are going to be looking at the chat function now for the questions. And the first question I have is, are there any universal ways of grieving that's been seen throughout all cultures? So I think grief in and of itself is universal because it's universal to humanity, losing a loved one. I think what happens is the expression of that grief or how one processes that grief is impacted by one's own culture, but one then develops its own individual culture. So I think while grieving and loss and bereavement as a concept are universal to humanity, I think it's really about not subscribing certain behaviors or certain needs to a specific culture, but being open to the fact that a person can embody several different cultures actually at the same time, and being open to how do we actually open conversations and space for that to address it for the person in front of you. The next question is, how can we increase equity in healthcare and in grief and bereavement support? Oh boy, that's a big question. I think at its outset, we need to recognize that there are inequities. I actually just read a paper this morning about dementia and how people who are Asian, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous in America and the United States have a much higher risk of developing dementia, likely because of neuroinflammation from experiences of a lifetime of racism. And so we need to actually be addressing these, but we can't address it if healthcare systems are still going by the we're colorblind paradigm, like with COVID-19, where they say we don't actually collect race-based data. So we need to collect race-based data to show that there are inequities that we know, and then we need to delve deeper into what is causing these inequities and really look at the systemic nature of how this is being affected. And then we need to recognize that racism exists in healthcare systems for healthcare providers within teams and for patients, and actually work to close that gap. But it's been many decades and years and over 150 years of this, and so it's going to take a long time and a huge commitment to actually get to that point. And then, like I said, with regards to increasing equity, it's really what my presentation was about, to actually acknowledge that these inequities exist, that they are not siloed to grief and bereavement, but they are about everything that shows up in a person right up to the point where they're grieving and bereaved, and how do we actually support them. Can we touch more on internalized and interpersonal racism? Yes. So interpersonal racism is the dynamics between individuals that come from the systemic and institutional messages that one gets living in society. So if you grow up with messages that a certain race has certain characteristics and you make assumptions to the person in front of you with that race, that's interpersonal racism, or you make a negative comment like, oh, all people of X race are some sort of negative stereotype. That is interpersonal racism. It also could be more subtle. It could be, so it's not just calling somebody a slur. It could be much more subtle, and that could be in how you might be internally and implicitly matching or judging somebody based on your predisposed assumptions of that person. So, for example, Asian women are considered to be meek and docile and subservient and must be agreeable. And so many people will say, having met me for the first time, you're way more outspoken than I assumed. And what is that assumption based on? It's actually based on a racist stereotype, having not known me before. So that's an example of that. So for internalized racism, this is specific. So we all have internalized oppression. So if you're a female, we all have internalized sexism, for example, the messages of sexism. For racialized people, we have internalized racism so that we can actually have racist thoughts about our own race. We can have racist thoughts about ourselves not being good enough, not being as good as white people. And then we can also have racism that we internalize, again, because we're steeped in this culture every day. And that shows up in, again, giving, not supporting racialized people, giving white people the benefit of the doubt and not standing up and speaking up for racialized people who have been harmed, for wanting to, want to be more comfortable and be silent and not stick your neck out for another person, which then allows racism to continue to be perpetuated. What would you say is the most important thing we should take away and share with others on this topic? So I think the most important thing is that just like all of medicine, it's not race neutral. And we I think have tended to think in Canada, especially, that it's race neutral, and it's not. And it's not because of individual hate, or it's not because of a cumulative effect of individual people. It's actually because of the systemic nature of which we're steeped in which the colonial racist institution of healthcare in Canada is steeped in from its outset. And I hope that my presentation has at least introduced the concept that from its beginnings, these policies had racism baked in. And so we need to acknowledge that to have any hope of addressing it. Thank you so much for the comments. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention to this important topic, and I hope it spurs further reflection and thoughts within your grief and bereavement teams. Thank you.